Good morning. We're going to get started. It's a few minutes after 10 o'clock, so please grab a seat, some refreshments at the back of the room if you haven't already. I'm so thankful all of you are here today, and for those of you I have not met, my name is Andy Bicking. I'm the Director of Public Policy for Scenic Hudson, and we are so appreciative of all of you taking your time to come out and learn a little bit more about what it takes to create a community preservation fund in your municipality. By way of introduction, I want to kind of first give a little bit of an orientation to what a community preservation fund is, so we're all on the same page. But before I do that, I just want to make sure that we're all aware of a few important considerations in the room. The main entry and exit is here. The back of the room has an emergency exit, which is alarm triggered. So if you go out that door, please be sure to light a fire on your way out. And if you need the restroom at any point during the day, straight down the hallway past the administrative desk. You can't miss it on the other end of the building. I think everyone is on the same page about what a community preservation fund is, but just to kind of make sure we're all there. Community Preservation Fund is a program that was established in the state of Massachusetts in the 1980s. And then in the 1990s, it was adopted in New York State on communities on the east end of Long Island in Suffolk County. And since that time, on Long Island and in a few other pockets throughout the state, it has really been transformative in terms of giving a tool to local government and a revenue stream to do some critical work that's related to open space protection, park creation, farmland protection, and historic preservation. Essentially, that is funded by a real estate transfer fee, which is put in place locally. And that's somewhat of an unusual tool in New York State. That is something that needs to actually be approved and sanctioned by the state legislature and the governor's office. So after the program was piloted on Long Island in the 1990s, it started trickling up the Hudson River Valley. It came to the towns of Red Hook and Warwick. We were very lucky to have the supervisors of both of those communities with us today. And it has really been an incredible tool for those communities to achieve their local community preservation goals. Then in 2007, Scenic Hudson and a number of other partners worked to pass the Hudson Valley Community Preservation Act, which granted this authority to municipalities within Westchester and Putnam County. And then this past year, we joined with many advocacy partners to add communities in Ulster County to the Community Preservation Act. That bill is awaiting signature by the governor, and knock on wood, we're very optimistic that come January 1, communities in Ulster County will have this ability as well. We also have a few standalone communities in the region that have this authority. The community of Chester has a bill, again, waiting to be signed by the governor. Hopefully that will come about, as well as Chatham, Fishkill, and a few other pockets elsewhere in the region. Creating a community preservation fund is not a simple endeavor. It's something that is complex. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy, but it's also a program that really will generate a lot of benefits for your community for years and years to come. It basically comes down to three simple steps that local government needs to go through. First, they need to create a community preservation plan. That plan needs to then be approved by the town board and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. They then need to propose a real estate transfer fee at the local level, which needs to be put on the ballot in the general election. And then finally, that ballot referendum needs to be passed by a majority of voters within the community. Now, there's a lot more I could say about kind of all the legal requirements to create a community preservation fund. We will be following up with a copy of the legislation so everyone here can take that back to their hometown, can look at it and review it and get familiar with it. But I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of a few of the big picture goals and how the program worked. So finally, it's a run of show for the day. We are going to end up at about 1 o'clock this afternoon. We'll promise to get you out of here on time. However, if you would like to stay and talk with folks who have been through the Community Preservation Fund process in the past. We will be here. You can talk with us at that time. We'll be kicking things off this morning in just a few minutes with a very simple readiness assessment. You saw when you came in at the small table there were two workshops, two worksheets, both the pre and post workshop Community Preservation Fund Readiness Assessment. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes and then have you fill out the pre-workshop assessment to kind of begin thinking a little bit about the steps you will need to take at a local level. And then we'll be following up at the end of the program today with the post-workshop assessment. Hopefully, having learned something during the day, you can reevaluate where you're at. Following the readiness assessment, we have a first panel discussion today facilitated by Michelle Smith, the Hudson Highlands Land Trust. We have a great set of folks who have been involved as advocates, as partners to local government and resource providers, the nonprofit and New York State community to help communities develop the information that they need to create a community preservation fund. So we'll be talking about some best practices. And then following a brief break for lunch, we will then be moving into the second panel discussion of the day, which is an opportunity to talk with our town supervisors who have community preservation funds, as well as advocates and researchers who have experience passing ballot referenda in New York State and around the country. So we're very grateful for the visitors who have come to join us today for that. And then finally, we'll wrap up the day with the post-event readiness assessment. So I just want to take a moment and acknowledge a special guest who's here today. Max Cordella from Senator Metzger's office is here. Say hi, everyone, Max.
Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here.
Senator Metzger, as many of you may know, is a true champion of conservation, both before she was elected into state office as a senator, and now that she is representing much of Ulster and Sullivan and Orange County and Albany, she is proving again and again to truly be someone who's dedicated to the cause of conservation, and was the sponsor of the Ulster County Community Preservation Act bill, again waiting signature by the governor, as well as the Orange County Community Preservation Act bill, which those of you who live in Orange County know we were not successful in getting that through the Senate, but I can assure you that was no fault of Senator Metzger. She did everything she could to advance that cause. So without further ado, I want to introduce everyone to Kevin Macdonald, who joins us from the Nature Conservancy on Long Island, who will be giving us just a little bit of background and helping you all walk through the readiness assessment. Kevin?
Thank you. So in 1996, but actually started in 1984, I'd been involved in the pursuit of passage of the Community Preservation Fund. We got it passed in 1996. In 1997, it was vetoed by the governor. We passed it again in 98 and then put it on the ballot. And along the way, I learned many things. And so my message for all of you who are about to embark on this journey, this is different than anything you've ever done. It'll be harder than most things you've ever done, but well worth it. And the readiness assessment assignment that you have this is a self-test. From your view of the world, knowing what you know in the present moment, go through this chart and ask yourself, as best you can, truthfully, where do you think you are in your community, in the place you're working, in the place you're trying to imagine a community preservation fund existing, and just score it as best you can. And what we're going to do, partly through this exercise, is this is your perception of the world before the rest of the conference and conversation happens. And then you're going to do it again at the end. I promise you the results will be different between the first and the second rundown. And the purpose of that is really for you to kind of come to grips with a full understanding of what this entails. And the final point I want to make on this is some of this appears to be daunting. And if like everything else, if you do it in bite-sized pieces, you'll have no trouble doing this. But this is not a simple undertaking, and it's a process. This is not a rock and roll concert where you go to once and you go, that was awesome. Right? This is a life-affirming experience. You're all about to death. And for those of us that have succeeded, we actually did have fairly significant lifelong friends from the experience, and others that have gotten their own community preservation fund, I'm sure will attest to that. So please do the drill. Andy, everybody has it, right? So you take, how many minutes? 10, 5?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. So this is a rapid assessment. Don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about it. Answer it as best you can. Put it in your little folder when you're done, and we're going to do a different version of it at the end. And if it's exactly the same at the end, there's something wrong, and I promise you it won't be. So anyway, thank you, and I'll look forward to chatting with some of you later.
Okay, from the sound of the room, we can assume that I think everyone's made some progress in your readiness assessment. So what we'd like you to do with that now is fold it up into a neat square and stick it in your pocket. Right, this is not a graded exercise.
I'm going to go so.
Before we transition to our panel discussion, I would just like to take a moment to acknowledge the Scenic Hudson staff members that helped organize today's event. Kari is in the red shirt, who I think many of you heard from. And our wizard behind the scenes is Althea Malarkey, also here. Both of them will be available if you have any questions or anything that needs attending to today. So at this time, I would like to turn the mic over to Michelle Smith, the Executive Director of the Hudson Highlands Land Trust, and also to invite our panelists on the first panel to please come on up and have a seat at the table.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Hudson Highlands Land Trust, and I'm the moderator of this panel. I wanted to start by introducing our esteemed panelists. I'm not going to read their bios because you have their bios in your packet. So I just wanted to just talk about their experience, how they have the experience in this topic, and maybe a fun fact or two about each of our speakers. So Carla Castillo is becoming extremely well known across the Hudson Valley because of her day job and her night job. And I've come to think of her sort of as like the Oprah of Hudson Valley conservation because she's known completely by one name. As soon as you say Carla, everybody knows exactly who you're talking about. And the reason for that is during the day, she is the Deputy Director at the Hudson Valley Regional Council, and she's focused on, she runs the Clean Energy Communities Program. And then by night, she transforms into the chair of the Conservation Advisory Council for the town of Cornwall, where in her tenure there, she's not only headed up the completion of a natural resource inventory, but also an open space inventory. And our next speaker is also seemingly ubiquitous across the Hudson Valley, and that is Laura Heady. And the reason that she's everywhere is because she heads up conservation and land use at the DEC Hudson River Estuary Program. And what you may not know about her is even though all the primate communities know Laura, the millions of frogs and salamander communities across New York State also know who Laura is because she runs the Amphibian Migration Project, which is where lots of people get out during the spring and help frogs and salamanders cross the road to their vernal pools. So a lot of us know everything we know about vernal pools because of Laura. Next we have Kari Watkins Bates, who heads up farmland protection at Scenic Hudson. Scenic Hudson has protected tens of thousands of acres of farmland across New York State. And one wonderful thing they do every September is the farmland cycling tour, which I believe you're very involved in. And that cycles through, on your bicycle you can visit lots of farms in Dutchess and Columbia counties. And if you haven't done that tour, I highly recommend it. It's mostly flat, it's not the terrain of the Hudson Highlands, it's more flat farmland, so it's very doable. And then next we have Erin Tobin, who has a different set of experience on historical resources. She's the Vice President of Policy and Preservation at the Preservation League of New York, and I'm pleased to say that recently she was appointed to the esteemed Hudson Valley Greenway Conservancy Board in 2019, so congratulations on that. So what we're going to do for our panel this morning is really take advantage of the experience that Carla has on Conservation Advisory Council and the respective natural resources, historic and farmland expertise that we have of our other three panelists. And first of all, we're just going to start with each of the panelists, starting with Carla and going in the order that they're seated in, kind of giving a 5-minute overview of their experience with this topic and anything else they'd like to share. And then after that, I'll have a separate question, one separate question on best practices, and then on how municipalities with limited resources can get funding support and technical support from other organizations. So Carla, do you want to take it away?
Thank you very much, Michelle. Okay, there we go. Can everybody hear me well enough? So thank you. Hello? 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 There we go. All right. So I'm going to provide a snapshot today of the possible starting point for an establishment of a community preservation fund with the Cornwall CAC's story. Our 9-member CAC serves both the town of Cornwall and the village of Cornwall on Hudson. Like other CACs, we hold annual cleanups, plant trees, and engage our neighbors in community events. We also use retreats to plan for future projects, which has allowed us to focus our efforts and identify and pursue funding for projects like purchasing recycling bins. Over the past 3 years, we pursued the development of 3 planning products to support the town's and villages' long-term planning and land use decisions, thanks to the support of the Hudson River Estuary Program. CAC members' roles range from product development through research, writing, and mapping analysis, to intensive input and review, to engaging the public. Thank you. Community interest and participation across these projects has been very broad. By working with estuary program staff and key partners, we developed well-researched and accessible planning tools. We started with the Cornwall Natural Resources Inventory, modeling it on the Estuary Program's guide. The NRI covers, as you all know, natural, scenic, cultural, and historic resources. We partnered with the town of Blooming Grove, CAC, on this intermunicipal project. The Orange County Water Authority provided GIS mapping support and produced 26 maps, some of which I'm going to quickly share. This land cover map shows the pervious and impervious areas in Cornwall. While much of the information contained in NRI maps may already be known in a community, maps highlight the value of having information available in a visual format that is accessible to all people. This equalizes the knowledge base within a community. For example, many may not know the degree to which a community has high habitat value for rare plants and animals. This steep slopes map shows areas where development, if allowed, would require significant attention to drainage and post-construction water flow. The designated and possible wetlands shown here can inform zoning code updates. With increasing heavy precipitation events, yes, that's the right slide. Emergency planning can be informed by a map showing frequently flooded areas, maps noting the health of water bodies and the presence of aquifers and public sources here in relationship to risk sites are increasingly important given water quality and water availability concerns. Cornwall NRI maps are available on Orange County's Department of Planning website. The town and village will make a full report available online and by hard copy. Our next project was the Cornwall Scenic Resources Inventory. The Estuary Program connected us with Cornell University's Department of City and Regional Planning, which conducted a more focused analysis of our scenic resources. Here, planning students are presenting their initial findings at the CAC's annual holiday party. Here, Cornell's project lead, Professor George Franz, discusses CAC members' comments during subsequent rounds of public input, which resulted in the development of this composite map of high-value scenic areas that inform our next body of work. The Cornwall Natural Heritage Project is an open space index consisting of a map and narrative. This was also a collaborative effort with the Blooming Grove CAC. Our OSI process used substantive public input and the NRI report data to identify and prioritize areas with high conservation value. Thank you. Guidance and support from our project partners, the Hudson Highlands Land Trust, Orange County Land Trust, and Behan Planning and Design was key to this project's success given the project's technical nature. Our public meetings captured the imagination of our community. In this shot, you see how people are clamoring to spend their conservation dollars for the preservation of different resources. Analysis of the results revealed that attendees prioritized aquifers and water supply. From a publicly available survey, we learned that our community placed a high value on almost all resources except for active recreation areas. Analysis also revealed that respondents' favorite places were linked to the love of recreation in natural settings and the aesthetic beauty of these settings. The public input process also included mapping exercises where community members would reference the NRI maps as they noted their local knowledge of our resources and considered the conservation value of various areas. None of this work would have been possible without the support and active participation of Cornwall's elected officials and planning board members. Tuesday, the Cornwall CAC will unveil its NHP OSI map and report. Today, I can share what we believe to be an innovative feature. This is a pretty dense slide, and I don't expect you to read it all, but the icons denote the conservation value characteristics of the conservation areas identified. They're going to be next to each of the conservation areas representing, it's a quick eye view, like is this an important bird area? Is this great for hiking? Is this important for water resources, for example? And the goal in using these icons was to increase the report's ease of use and the interest in this as a planning tool. Thanks to the Blooming Grove CAC being a few steps ahead, I can share their OSI map to give a sense of Cornwall's final product. I'd like to close by noting the inspiration that Blooming Grove is. At the town's October 15th board meeting, the Blooming Grove passed a resolution adopting the Natural Heritage Open Space Inventory map and its description, something that we hope will also happen in Cornwall. Thank you.
Laura, do you want to talk a little bit about NRIs and maybe touch on open space inventories as well?
Sure. I'm happy because Carla's going to actually make it seem like I speak slowly, so thank you for that, because I'm usually accused of talking too fast. So I'm going to give a little introduction and overview of natural resource inventories, which Carla's already alluded to. But first, just to, where am I? Let's see, there we go. To just kind of help you understand why NRIs are part of the Community Preservation Fund process. Really, natural resource inventories, or NRIs, are a foundational planning tool, no matter what kind of planning you're pursuing. But for setting priorities for a CPF, the NRI is a really important first step. And so the conservation approach that I'm sure many of you involved in land protection or any sort of conservation work follow, and what we've been encouraging communities to do is to first just identify what you have, use that information, as Carla has talked about, to then set priorities, and then finally use those priorities to plan, protect, or manage what your community cares about. So the NRI part of this process is really that first step of identifying what you have. And as Michelle pointed out, the open space inventory, you may hear that term also, that's really technically where you take the inventory and you set priorities and you create a prioritization based on parcels. So that kind of gets into that deeper step of prioritization. But what is a natural resources inventory? And I actually have 5 copies of this guidebook, where is it, over here, that we published back at the end of 2014. Myself and my colleague Ingrid Hagel wrote this based on a guidebook that was developed in New Hampshire. And it kind of lays out the process and the content of a natural resources inventory. But really what the inventory is a compilation of maps and data and descriptive information about the natural resources in your community. They're often expanded to include things like farmland, which Kari's going to talk about, and historical and cultural resources, which Erin will talk about. But really, the essence of the inventory should include what the community wants to know about. And so our guidebook outlines what data sets are widely available already through state and national data sets. But what we find is some communities recognize during this process that they might have information they need to develop. So, for example, source water studies might be needed. We've worked with some urban communities that recognized they needed a street tree inventory. Perhaps they were inspired by Newburgh's. And so this process, I often feel, is almost as important as the end product, because it really helps the community learn, as Carla alluded to, about the resources they have, but also what they need to know more about. And perhaps that will be the reason to pursue funding to have studies done to collect those other data sets. But the basics of what we encourage communities to include like geology, topography, slopes, things like that, water resources, whether it be aquifers, drinking water sources, as well as water-related habitats like streams, wetlands, other habitats, forests. Thank you for showing the forest map. That was great to see. But also rare species habitat, significant biodiversity areas. Again, cultural resources are one of the pieces of an NRI. We also have been encouraging communities to think about climate conditions when writing their NRI, because really when we talk about climate adaptation, And nature-based solutions, knowing about the resources in your community, can help be one of the steps towards being strategic about climate adaptation, whether it be protecting your floodplains, protecting forests for temperature moderation, things like that. And then finally, land use, kind of giving a current snapshot of what land use is happening in your communities, all part of the inventory. And so to give you kind of a look at what that can look like, I know Carl has already shared some maps, but these are some from the town of Putnam Valley. And on average, I think a lot of the inventories we've worked with, and right now, since publication of our guidebook, about 25 communities have been pursuing inventories with help from our program through grants and technical assistance, but they're generally averaging, I think, about 25 to 30 maps, depending on how complex the town endeavor is. And then along with the maps, of course, there has to be some detailed information that interpret the maps, explain what's important in the community about that resource, and perhaps also include some discussion of risks and recommendations. So who does complete an NRI? This actually, NRIs were detail included in the enabling legislation in our state municipal law that identifies that conservation advisory councils, like the commission that Carla is on, are the ones responsible for inventorying open spaces in a municipality. And at the county level, it was the EMC, or the Environmental Management Council. In practicality, sometimes, especially back in the day, I think CACs were really developing NRIs on Mylar sheets, with help probably from their county agencies. Today it's gotten much more complex with GIS, with an ever-expanding amount of data sets. I feel like every day I'm getting an email about a new and awesome data set that we need to learn about. So we've actually then, I think, been seeing more where CACs are involved as kind of the manager of a project, maybe with a consultant that's hired through some grant funding. But there have been some NRIs that we've actually connected them to, like maybe a grad student or a college intern who can help with doing a basic inventory and then getting help from the CAC. So how to develop an NRI, let me see what I've got here. So there's the NRI guidebook, which again, like I said, I brought 5 copies, but that outlines the process. It's also available on the DEC website. And then the next big question, if you're going to go through this process, is to really think about what your community capacity is. The degree of social capital or volunteer capability varies from town to town. In a lot of communities, the same volunteers are doing everything and anything, and they're pretty burnt out. So I think kind of taking stock of what your capacity is from a volunteer perspective. Can speak to that. Also, does your community have actual planning staff? We work with municipalities that have their town hall that's only open maybe 4 hours a week, and we work with municipalities that have planning staff that are available 5 days a week. So it really varies. So thinking about who's going to work on this, can your county help? County planning agencies, Orange County's been great in working with us on these projects. And then also thinking about your ability to apply for funding. And we'll talk more about funding, I think, as the panel discussion continues. But there are funds available for New York State and for Hudson Valley municipalities in particular for NRIs. And then finally, the important practice is to think about what are the long-term objectives of developing your NRI. Is it a tool for your planning board to refer to during decision making? If so, what format does it need to be in to be useful and accessible to the planning board? I know like the city of Poughkeepsie, they actually turn their NRI into an online map so that the planning board can access it online and review proposals and refer to that. Maybe you want the NRI to be part of an open space plan or, ta-da, a community preservation plan, in which case, thinking about how the GIS maps are going to be assembled and developed so that they can be, and by GIS, is anybody not familiar with GIS? Thinking ahead about how the GIS maps and the data should be assembled so that they can then be used by maybe a future contractor that's going to actually go through the analysis to set priorities with the town, or maybe turn it into a community preservation plan. So thinking ahead for all these pieces of the puzzle, I think, is important in scoping out an inventory process. And I was going to give you, a quick case study of a little success story, not about the CPP, but just how the NRI is a foundation. The town of Owarsing, which is a very rural community in Ulster County, it sits between the Catskill Mountains and the Shawangum Ridge, and the Rondale Creek flows through it. Back in 2014, they developed, essentially it was an NRI. They called it an open space inventory, and we loosely use these terms. They called it an open space inventory. It really was a description and a mapping of all the natural areas in their community. And then in In 2018, they partnered with their neighboring town to develop an open space plan. And in that plan, they established a number of very specific recommendations, which are also a very important thing. Be specific with your recommendations. And one of theirs was to adopt critical environmental areas. And they did successfully adopt these in 2019, and there are 2 areas, one of which helps connect the landscape in between the Catskills and the Shawangum Ridge, and another, a very large wetland complex that has significant habitat and rare species. So we're applauding them as a model community and really showing how the inventory can be the basis for planning and policy. And I'll just close with saying, I feel like NRIs help you establish an insurance policy for your community. You wouldn't buy a house insurance policy without thinking about what kind of house do I have? What size is it? Do I have a garage? You know, do I have a swimming pool? What am I trying to insure? What are the risks? Is it a wooden house? Is it a stone house? Where's the nearest fire department? You have to think about all that when you plan for insuring your house. What are you planning for, you know, when you insure the future of your community? Your ability to be resilient to climate, your ability to have wildlife, clean water, clean air, and so forth. And so I think the inventory is the first step to really creating an effective policy for your future of your community.
All right, so Kari from Scenic Hudson is going to talk about farmland.
Strategy, so I'll hold the mic as well. Laura, I'm going to send a skip through the last of your slides here. Oh yeah, let's do that. I hope it wasn't too important.
No, that was in case there was a question.
Oh, sorry, I didn't anticipate animation between the slides. So really quickly, you've heard a little bit about Scenic Hudson. We've been working in the realm of farmland protection here for a bit. And in my short time, I'm going to focus in on inventorying or understanding really your community's agricultural resources. And so much of what Laura and Carla have shared about other types of resources all holds true for agricultural resources as well. So I'll gloss over those. And I really want to focus on kind of navigating existing inventories, plans, technical service, financial service opportunities, ag and farmland groups, and give you a little glimpse into understanding your soils and your agricultural infrastructure, which will be important in terms of understanding your agricultural resources as you think about planning for a CPF or any other agricultural work. So when we think about the inventories that are available, I will also speak quickly, but I'm going to note there's this handout that was available, and everything that I'm going to touch on, by and large, is here with available links, so don't feel as though you've got to get it all jotted down. When we think about agricultural inventories that already exist, you want to think about those things that are already identified through state designations and already within your community's information data bank. And this is going to be real property tax data that shows what parcels are identified as farms. It's going to include agricultural districts that your county's Ag and Farmland Protection Board have enrolled or unenrolled people from, and it's going to include your local agricultural assessments. So all of that is good baseline data to understanding from a spatial sense where your farms are located. Then, when you look more granularly, you can also look at trends and information about your community, usually by the county level. It's hard sometimes to find it by the town, but you want to rely also on your USDA Census of Agriculture, and there's other resources out there as well. I gave an example to the town of Rochester through the New York State's OPRHP program for historic farmstead inventories. Your town may already have undertaken some of this. So look thoroughly through what inventories already exist for your town. And then don't underestimate the ability to collect really valuable information that's not necessarily high tech. A lot of what we've talked about does rely on sophisticated GIS analysis, but a lot of it also can rely on your community and your volunteers' ability to understand what's in their town. Visual kind of windshield tours, aerial imagery through something as simple as Google Maps or Google Earth are going to be a really important tool that you can use and are relatively low tech. There are also a suite of planning documents out there available. Look and see on a statewide, regional, county, and town level what you already have and what inventories these already include and what planning they've already attended to. So again, at the statewide level, everything from the open space plan that might focus on farmland protection, either as a regional concern or within your region, might also include individual parcels. your county ag and farmland protection plans, your local farmland protection plans, and I'll have to give a shout out to other plans and inventories created by nonprofits or other groups, including Scenic Hudson's Food Shed Conservation Plan, which inventories and prioritizes farms throughout the Hudson Valley based on size and soils. I'll make a note here, and I know that we'll talk about it a little bit further on, but if your community, either at the town level or more granularly at the county level, have either outdated or no farmland protection planning, this is an important place where state funding is available and lots of times largely underutilized for that purpose. You want to think about the service providers that already exist. This includes the Soil and Water Conservation District and your county farmland protection boards. They have lots of data available and both can act as both technical and sometimes it can act as a technical service provider through some of this work. Time on that. If you are in an area in Ulster County, for instance, you want to think about what other groups are focused on agriculture in your community. Groups like the Rondout Valley Growers Association, they've done a large inventory. That information exists. Again, just kind of utilizing what's there. And then last, I want to focus in on my last 2 minutes on where I think folks sometimes need a little bit more information in terms of really understanding their agricultural resources. It's one thing to understand the inventory, where your farms are, who's there, who's come and gone historically, but a lot of that is based on the underlying natural resources of your soils and your agricultural infrastructure. And so these are two really important pieces that you probably have, if you have agriculture in your community, you probably have a repository of wealth on this, but understanding the importance of soil and soil quality to farmland, farm operations, and where as a community you'll want to identify and perhaps prioritize farmland protection is really important. And so, again, utilize your resources to understand soil groups and land capability class codes and USDA soil designations and drainage and all of those things. You probably already have that expertise in your community if you have farmers. And then also tie that too with critical agricultural infrastructure. And that can be anything from, if your town has the last remaining small fruit processor, that might be a really important piece of inventory to understand to your overall farmland resources in your community. If you live in the black dirt, where's the drainage facilities? If you live in a place that has flooding, like a Rondout Creek runs through, where are your levees and who's maintaining those? Also, critical environmental or critical agricultural infrastructure, understanding those things. So I'll pass it up there and we'll talk a little bit more about funding. And again, everything that I've talked about is in a handout with available links where they exist. And there you go.
All right, so now I'm going to talk about the built environment, which is really the other side. The existing built environment is the other side of conserving open space and recognizing what your natural resources are. And so a little bit, the Preservation League of New York State, we're the statewide historic preservation nonprofit, so we're based in Albany. We work all over the state. We have a variety of programs. What I'm going to focus on today are the cultural resource survey component, understanding your historic resources and funding that is available for that. One of the things I'm going to just mention very, very quickly, in addition to that, historic resources, the built environment, requires a different type of maintenance and repair in terms of funding and upkeep than open space and your natural resources. So I want everybody in the audience to know that there are funds available from a variety of sources that can help municipalities and nonprofits repair their historic buildings, maintain their historic buildings. And so two of those are through a partnership program that we have with the New York State Council on the Arts. We actually have funding through the Hudson River Valley National Heritage Area for grants to help nonprofits and municipalities. So if you've gone through the Community Preservation Fund process and you have historic resources that you want to protect, there are funds available to help you figure out what to do with those. And I think that's really important to understand. In terms of figuring out where your historic resources are, and it's not just historic, it's architectural and cultural. This is the built environment that has significance across the board. We have a program, Preserve New York. It's another program that's a partnership with, like I said, with the New York State Council on the Arts. We have funding from a variety of regional sources to augment that, and that funds, what I'm going to focus on are the cultural resource survey component of what Preserve New York funds. When you get to the point where you have a building, we can talk about the other 3 site-specific funding sources. But a cultural resource survey, what is a cultural resource survey? It's an inventory of historic resources. It can be in a municipality. It determines historic, architectural, and cultural significance. Again, it can be lead to creation of a historic district. It can lead to inform a community's plan, a comprehensive plan. It doesn't have to lead to a historic district, and I think what's really important to understand about historic districts is that there are different levels. There's the state and national register, and there's a local historic district. And so a lot of people conflate those 2 things, and I'm going to talk about the state and national register because that is where some of those other funding sources kick in. And that's the kind of survey. Flooding was mentioned. For example, after Irene and Lee and Sandy, there were inventories done of historic buildings that could qualify for the National Register as a part of the flood damage mitigation. So it's really helpful to have these kinds of surveys done in advance. It is something that is not regulatory in the way that local historic districts are, and it leads to a lot of financial incentives. So that is why it's very helpful. There are historic tax credits that are available for privately owned buildings. So we can help a lot with communities when they're thinking about inventorying their historic resources. This map here shows, and this is through the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. They have their own GIS system, and that shows in red it has been surveyed and designated. What is in orange is qualifying for our state historic tax credits, which again is a financial incentive available to property owners who have a historic building, who want to and need to do repair rehabilitation on that building. There are incentives available. We're very lucky to have a state historic tax credit program. You can see it sort of circles the village of Montgomery right there. And then in terms of applying for grants, we have a variety of, like I said, we have this grant program. You can apply to us in the spring for funding for a cultural resource survey. We have, often we partner with the Hudson River Valley National Heritage Area and Greenway, so if a community is looking to do this cultural resource inventory, you can get funds from us. Those can be matched with funding from other sources, like the Greenway. If you have a local district, there can be some sources of funding from the State Preservation Office. So there's contact information up there. Our information's online, and I'd be happy to talk later with more information about that program.
Thanks to all of our panelists. I think what I'm going to do, given the time we have left for this panel, I would love to get some audience questions. I think what I'm going to do in terms of cycling through the panelists again with my question, my 2 questions are really on sort of best practices, lessons learned, and also funding sources, because I think, to the panelists, and all of you know this very well, this is a lot of work. Doing these inventories is a lot of work for municipalities, and we know that the municipalities are subject to the tax cap now, so it's hard to find the resources, both the funding and the human resources, to get all this work done. So the question I'd like to ask, I will ask you a 2-fold question. First of all, given the work that's involved and the number of people, there's a lot of cat herding involved in doing these projects. what are the two, say, either best practices or lessons learned that rise to the top of your list that you think others should know who are embarking on this process? And my second question is, where can municipalities go to get the staffing resources and technical expertise and funding to help with these? Because very few municipalities have the ability to do all of this work just with their existing staff. So I'll ask whoever's ready, because I know I've kind of, some of you I discussed before. If I took you by surprise, I know Laura's ready, I know, Kari is ready because she talked about funding. So, or Carla, if you feel ready, we'll start with you again.
Sure. I think I'm best. I think I'm best suited to respond to the herding cats aspect. So we were very fortunate to have the support and flexibility to think through from the Hudson River Estuary Program how to support the work that we were trying to do by starting off with the NRI. And without the technical support connecting us with Orange County Water Authority and all the other partners along, in terms of the Cornwall Scenic Resources Inventory and the Open Space Inventory, we would not have been able to get any of this done. But the crux of everything that we did, of course, depended on our volunteers. And while we've had a 9-member group, it's really been 5 who've really risen to the top and done a tremendous amount of work since 2017. And it really has been a lot of work. And I think in terms of the best practice, and I commend and congratulate them and thank them for their work. Some of them are actually in the audience today. But I think in terms of a best practice as a starting point, I believe that a little bit more of a primer in terms of really reading through the NRI guide and understanding like what we're supposed to be getting at the end of this product would be helpful, because it helps along the way in terms of knowing where we really were shooting for as opposed to kind of figuring it out along the way. And then just to continue to keep your volunteers inspired, which can sometimes be a little bit difficult, but that's where passionate people come in. You have passionate people who join the project and it gets done eventually.
Yes, and I applaud Carla for sticking with it, because I know it's been a long process. So in terms of funding that's available, I can think of 3 key funding sources that are available to support the development of natural resource inventories, at least, and to some extent, open space inventories and planning. So the Hudson River Valley Greenway has Greenway grants. There's 4 cycles a year, and they're smaller, but I think for an NRI that could be an adequate size to fund the development of inventory. We also at the Hudson River Estuary Program, pending the state budget, have estuary grants on an annual basis, and we've specifically created eligible projects as NRIs, open space inventories, open space plans, also conservation finance feasibility studies we added, and also development of a community preservation plan. So there's funding explicitly for these sorts of outcomes, which we're really hoping to see from municipalities. And also the New York State Climate Smart Communities funding program. The Climate Smart Communities, the recommendations associated with that also include developing NRI, developing conservation plans. And so there's also funding through that program for NRIs. At least there has been the last couple of years. I think every year they may change the project criteria, but hopefully that will continue. So those are 3 key sources that are available to New York State, and 2 of them specifically to Hudson Valley communities. I already covered best practices because I'm sure I went over, but I would just echo what Carla was saying, and I think while it wasn't about a community preservation fund, that example from Awarsing, one of the things that really enabled them to be successful was there was a key core group of volunteers, appointed or committee members and environmental commission members that were through it for the whole process, and they kept, as you have, good communication with their elected officials, so the elected officials always knew what was happening. They provided that continuity in overseeing the consultants, and so I think that's really important for thinking about the process and also thinking about what the end game is. Like, you know, it's not just about developing a set of nice maps. It's really about implementing it in a way that's going to help your community see a, you know, more resilient and better future. And so thinking in advance about what it's going to turn into, I think, is important consideration in shaping what it's going to be as you go through each step.
May I add just a tiny bit, just one second? The one thing that I failed to say that I think has been really important in this process is having the support of the elected officials. In my experience, sometimes a lot of elected officials are a little, you know, they don't want to share too much in terms of how positive they feel. They may not want to share about how positive they feel about the effort, but definitely not creating roadblocks for the volunteers. And that has been incredibly important in the work that we did at the end of the day, you know, feeling like we definitely have gotten it, you know, have gotten to the point of approval. And then also the partnerships that come with this. As I said, that OSI is a very technical product that it requires many layers of analysis. And the expertise of the Hudson Highlands Land Trust, Orange County Land Trust, and planning firms, those for that type of product is incredibly critical and also helps with the herding of the volunteer cats.
So I'll piggyback on that with 2 points. The first is to the funding question. Do be sure to be aware of the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets farmland planning grants that are available. They're probably the key piece for agricultural protection planning at the municipal level. Also, do key into where technical service providers already exist, and some of what you may be looking for might already be within the services they provide, either to individuals or to your community. And I just want to make a point, it's not necessarily a best practice piece, but I think as I'm sitting here, I'm recognizing that it could be very daunting if you're in a community that has not undertaken a farmland protection plan, a natural resources inventory, an open space inventory, a cultural resources inventory, that the idea that you would go through each of these monumental tasks in order to get to your community preservation plan probably might feel like a non-starter. And so to the risk of not making it sound that it's critically important, I guess I would say don't let perfect be the enemy of the good here, that you can incorporate all of these pieces into the community preservation plan. And I'm looking a little bit at Supervisor McKeon, who was there when the town of Red Hook, and we'll probably point to this, but I don't think their plan was, I think it's particularly good, but I don't think it was particularly, it didn't have, there were no technical service providers, there were no consultants, there weren't big paid consultants to get through. Am I remembering that correctly? It was a daunting task, but it was doable, right? Okay, so I'm gonna end up, it's a daunting task, but it's doable. Your community can do it too.
And I'll echo that. It is, I think I went over the funding sources for cultural resource inventories. I would say, please contact the Preservation League. What we do is work with communities, municipalities, nonprofits, citizens groups who are interested in this, and we can work with you on those steps. A key to the best practice is echoing, have elected officials on board, have your community on board. We don't want this to be a divisive community issue, and you won't succeed if it is. And hire professionals. It's great to have strong volunteers in your community. You need that, but you also need professional expertise, and that will help you get the funding to pay for them. It's very much of a you get what you pay for, and it's not super high-priced, fancy consultants. These are not tens and tens of thousands of dollar projects. You can do a cultural resource inventory in bits and pieces, spread out over a number of years to help you pay for it. So there's that. And again, in terms of layering, there are communities, and I'm thinking of one in the Finger Lakes region in particular, where there's a lot of development pressure, similar to the Hudson Valley. They got together, very grassroots, and just layered all of their plans, their open space plan, their farmland protection plan. We just funded a cultural resource survey because now they're looking and saying, we have these hamlets, we have these historic farmsteads. So, the Preservation League funded the Historic Farmstead Plan and inventory for the town of Rochester, just like we're funding, this is the town of Canandaigua, out in the Finger Lakes. So doing it all together and having that community input can do it before you reach the crisis point. And in terms of historic preservation, I can't drive that point home enough. Do it before you get to that crisis.
Just one quick thing to add too, which I'm glad Erin made me think. If you know that your final goal is to have a community preservation plan or an open space plan, you don't have to go through this process of let's do an inventory, just fold it in, because you're going to need to have a series of GIS maps in order to create a prioritization that's going to go into a community preservation plan or open space plan. So just wrap the inventory right into that, and that we've seen that happen too. Town of Pleasant Valley, their open space and farmland protection plan had an inventory wrapped right into that plan, for example. And actually, I could come up with other examples if it wasn't so fuzzy. But I'll just, again, that emphasis on thinking about what the purpose is going to be for the inventory.
Great. So I think we've got 15 minutes left in this panel, and I'd love to hear if anyone in the audience has questions. I know that many of you in the audience are at various stages of NRI, maybe just starting in the process. I know that I think we have recorded the award for highest attendance, that this is from the town of Blooming Grove, and I believe that you have a community preservation plan, so I wonder if you have any busting questions that you'd like to ask the panelists or anyone else in the audience.
How do we get this, our plan?
I'm concerned about getting the state legislature to pass a bill for us, and then getting the governor to sign it.
And I guess it might be helpful if you say, what town.
Blooming Grove.
Okay, thank you. And I'm not sure. So your question is about the Community Preservation Act and getting it passed, and I would look to Andy to answer that.
Yeah, right.
Great. Well, I'll first say this is an interest shared by many of the advocates and nonprofits in the room. It was not a topic that we were looking to kind of get into in a deep discussion today, but really focus more on what it takes to get to the place where you have a community preservation plan and a ballot referenda that can go before your voters. But that said, it is a very important consideration. I mean, you're well aware of where the Blooming Grove Authority landed in this year's legislative session. And yes, Scenic Hudson is committed to working with Supervisor Drolleman and Assemblyman Schmidt and Senator Skoufis to find a path forward where we can create common ground so we can get your community authority this year. There's a lot I could say about legislative strategy, right? And a lot of that are things that we won't know specifically how to address until the legislative session begins again in January. That will say that one of the most important things you can be doing is to kind of be building the education locally about this and communicating through your town board and your town supervisor to your state legislators and encourage them to advance legislation.
So this is a question about the community preservation plan. We're in the town of New Paltz, and we're interested in moving forward with this. We have numerous different plans, an open space plan, a historic preservation plan, and I'm wondering how specific we need to be. Do we need to go down to the parcel level exactly? Or one of the ideas we're thinking about is, instead of identifying each individual parcel in the preservation plan, because sometimes people may not like their parcel being identified, we're hoping to have build on the open space plan we already have, and so we have areas of town that have a high priority, and could we kind of lump all of the parcels in that area as a high priority for preservation, and then in maybe parts of the village where open space isn't an issue, they may be ranked, some of those parcels may be ranked high for historic preservation but not open space. And so kind of a very coarse way of having a community preservation plan but not going to the parcel level. Just some people don't like that, so I'm wondering, is that possible?
Are we covering that in the next section or no?
I don't think we are. Do you guys know the answer to that?
I think I know a little bit of the answer, but I'm going to qualify by saying I'm not completely sure. So if there's anybody in the room who is, please step in. My understanding is that your plan does need to be parcel specific, but I think that the
So anyway,
strategy
each
of
parcel, so we'll have a priority, but we won't, so the idea is that like all parcels within this one area will be given, say, a
The same
1 for a high priority. And then in other areas where open space isn't as important, they may have a 10 or something. And so each parcel will have a ranking, but it will be a very coarse ranking. So each parcel won't have like 10 criteria. It may all be based on a current plan that we have. That's just the thinking.
And I'm looking to Warwick and Red Hook to see if they can give a little advice here. I think theirs are each individually parcelized.
So what we did was we had overlay zones in our zoning, different things, aquifer protection, ridgeline, farmland. And so we overlaid that on maps and that defined the areas. And we listed the parcels. We didn't rank which parcel was better, but if a parcel was in multiple zones, it was a higher acquisition target.
Okay, so that explains.
Red Hook is similar. We've updated our plan a couple of times now. We take it by topic. So we did a fair expansion in the last reiteration. As you know, with the CPF, the priority is for agricultural lands, at least the legislation that enabled us to do the program. But we expanded significantly to include a lot of parcels in our community where water protection would be important to us. So we went from having a plan of, say, a couple hundred parcels to over 1,100 parcels that were eligible. And I guess what I would suggest is think in terms of this is an opportunity for a parcel owner, if they choose, because it's all voluntary, to participate. If they're not in the plan and they do want to participate and you do want to appropriate funds, you have to go through a lot of extra steps. So I would say throw in more than you think you might initially need. Yeah.
I would just double on that point, which is my understanding is that if a parcel is not in the plan anywhere and you should later want to fund it for some reason that you didn't think of at the time the plan was written, it's not eligible, or it'll only be through a very
I would also
complicated update.
And right, that there is the requirement, right, for the update every 5 years. So if you make mistakes and it's imperfect the first time, you do have a chance to add new criteria, new parcels in the future. And I guess it could be complicated, but at least if you start with a good product, it should be hopefully easier to update, and you can change course if your priorities are shifting too.
Hi, I'm from Assemblywoman Ellen Jaffe's office down in Rockland County, and we're here because we are in the very first stages of trying to preserve a Native American site of Lenape, who have both a historical, cultural, and religious significance. We're hoping that the tools we learn here will help us. We're in a much more a much different situation in that we don't have pretty much any farmland left, but we need these tools in preserving this site. And in reference to this woman's thing about the state legislature, I can just give a call out to our Assemblywoman. She is absolutely full on in preserving the environment in every step. But if anyone has any information that could help us with this step, we have also a volunteer here from Rockland County, from a land trust. So we're just in the very first stages, but unfortunately, time is of the essence because our local sewer district wants to sell this land for development, and it's a very, very special place. If anyone wants to come and tour it, it is just an amazing, amazing site. So.
I just want to respond to that. Is this, well, really, whether it's archaeological or above ground, there should be a State Historic Preservation Office review, and especially if we don't really fund archaeological surveys, but in terms of a cultural resource inventory or a cultural landscape report, depending on what that resource is, we have surveyed properties and districts, particularly I'm thinking out on Long Island, that have a Native American significance. And so that's something that we could help either fund, advocate for, contact me, and we can talk to you about that. But there's a lot of right now, I think there's a lot coming up in terms of Native American cultural sites, in terms of African American burial grounds. There's a lot of historic and cultural resources that are out there that people might not have realized exist. And so we're adapting the tools in terms of cultural resource inventories to make sure that we're encapsulating a complete history, and including sites that you might not look at and say, oh, that's a beautiful historic building, but it is a very important Native American site. So yeah, please speak with me. There might be some tools that we can help you with, and that sounds like it is an inventory type issue.
Yes, thank you.
I want to add just to that in the context of the good, perfect not being the enemy of the good, and your opportunity to update your plan and all of those pieces, which is things will change. And as more information comes along, I think one of the beautiful things about the Community Preservation Fund model is that it's replenishing. So it's not as though a bond act that will diminish and it's a race, right? I mean, you still might have race, you still might have more demand for the resources that you have, but you kind of think about it as an ongoing resource, and that you can get what you can under your belt now, and know that it's going to evolve over time as you utilize it.
Is there much time? Yeah, we've still got 2 minutes, yep.
This is not, unless somebody has a question, I was just going to pontificate about the importance. Just in terms of the best practice too, there's a lot of elected officials in the room, a lot of appointed volunteers who get heavily involved in these projects, but without awareness in the community about why the process is important and why the resources are important, I think sometimes these kind of initiatives can fail because of lack of community support. Carla was exhaustive in her list of people to contact to bring into these groups. How many people did you invite to the NRI review? Like hundreds.
Yes.
It was hundreds of people.
And I got 39, and you told me that would be very difficult to manage at the back end, and it has been, but it's actually good.
Well, those are reviewers, but you also have people coming to the public sessions. In any case, I think that if you know this is again, something you want to achieve, starting to have opportunities to get, residents out, seeing their large forests, seeing the wetlands that they have that are unique, looking at the floodplains, recognizing why they're important to them and their property and their health and all of that, I think is really key. And the village of Mount Kisco and village and town of Mount Kisco are a great example of a community that was one of our early adopters of doing an NRI and actually putting into their code a requirement to use the NRI for planning. And they took hundreds of people out on walks, to the stream, bird walks, all sorts of things. They got different groups involved, and that was part of really why I started the Amphibian Migration Project. I mean, I care about amphibians, but I also wanted people to get out and see firsthand what habitat fragmentation does, and so I think keeping that as part of your strategy for getting support in the long term, sustainable support. Yesterday I was at a conference, they used the term durable. Whether the plan is going to be durable, I think really matters in terms of having the support from all the different stakeholders, not just your elected officials, not just your key partners. Yeah, she's
Just Dave Church with Orange County. Just back to this parcel issue. I would caution, I've worked with a lot of constituents on these things, and I'd caution poisoning a process because key people don't want their parcels identified. You could blur, a lot of the data is coming in the parcel basis anyway, but you could blur those parcels at a policy level, like in an NRI, into what we call polygons, these resource areas. Because you can always route back to, is the parcel in or out of the resource area by a simple map exercise, if indeed you're going to go with the Community Preservation Act. I've always been sort of frustrated with that, the enabling legislation and why it's anchored in this necessity of having parcels, because there are clear jurisdictions that will never politically do that.
So I actually,
go ahead.
I'm sorry. I actually have a question back to the Orange County Land Trust representative, because we were, that was a point of discussion in the development of the open space inventory, and what seemed very clear is that for the NRI, we didn't need any parcels. That was not included at all. It was a very different type of mapping exercise, but for the open space inventory, it absolutely, my understanding is that it absolutely had to have the parcels in there in order for, in the future, a decision to be made around potential purchases. Matt, if you could, or Karen?
I can, or actually, I think the gentleman at the front was about, were you about to comment on that?
I can actually give you some background. So, in the first bill that was negotiated in New York, the parcel specificity issue was clarity that the development community wanted. They didn't want to hear this big open area was a target of protection and some other area wasn't, and that somebody purchased the other area and then it became, oh, this is the most important community parcel in the world. So the development community and the business community at the time made the argument successfully that they wanted a parcel-specific map for the purposes of clarity, and if a developer purchased a high-priority designated protected property, they did it at their own peril, right? So the CPF, to my knowledge, nowhere allows for condemnation. It's a voluntary sale. So that's, I agree with Robert's characterization. This is an option a landowner has. But for the purposes of today, the level of specificity on parcel-by-parcel management is so far in the weeds. You should be happy the day comes when that's the last thing you're discussing.
And there are ways to sort of navigate the parcel issue. It is required by the, as Dave Church said, it is required by the state legislation. But oftentimes the actual map themselves, and we've done this now in three towns, we've worked on projects where the maps themselves show the broad area. So like you say, you don't see, you see a ranking of the area. So maybe in town of Cornwall, town of Blooming Grove, there's 15 areas that are identified. Somewhere in the documentation, you need to identify the parcels that are attached to those areas. That doesn't have to be in the main document that everybody's seeing. It has to be available to the public, but it doesn't. You don't have to. This doesn't have to be front and center of your OSI. So I think there's definitely ways to navigate that. Have the discussion about why the parcel's in there, without people getting upset that their parcel is in there. And you have a question, yeah.
Well, I'm Doug Bloomfield, town supervisor in Goshen. I grew up there. And back in the 1950s, there were 150 dairy farms in Goshen. Today there are 2. That's 30,000 acres that have been for sale for the last, since probably 1985. And the government bought a lot of them for our 911 center and the jail and Orange Ulster BOCES, and it goes on and on. And we've probably built 500 homes in the last 15 years. And the town went out and bought 4 farms with purchase a development right program. We're still paying for it, okay? So we're doing, and then by the way, we had a very wealthy family who left their property to the community. It was probably 300 or 400 acres. So we probably preserved maybe 1,000 acres through some program or another. But now we're down to a point where people, the grandchildren of the farmers, are wanting to sell their property to get their equity out. Now, one of the things that's helping is the solar business, because you can put solar panels on it and it'll probably pay the taxes, although the school taxes are just running rampant. People are leaving our community. I had a primary and a general election, and I walked door to door. People are leaving New York State. The number one priority with them is not open space, is that can I afford to stay here? taxes are just crippling them. One man I talked to, he bought a brand new house in the village of Goshen, paid $15,000 taxes. Now he's paying $20,750 5 years later. Okay? So there's a lot of issues that get into this preservation of land. And I'm kind of confused, to be very candid with you, about what can I tell people? Oh, that's a very nice special parcel, but I'm so sorry, you can't sell it. We want to conserve that. How do we get, or even consider that conversation? Because things are going rampant. I mean, the fact is, in the town of Goshen, not the village, the town, we have $1.2 billion, well, we're going from $650 million assessable base to $1.2 billion by the year 2022. So things are going on. And by the way, the 2 farms that are available, okay, one of them, the guy already said, gee, I'm out of here. You know, now I've got to, I mean, he's going to probably shut down this farm next year. It's 300 acres for a myriad of reasons. Everything from farmland, the farmers now can be, the workers can be unionized, and just all kinds of things. And in the dairy business, there's just no profit, none whatsoever. So we got to hurry and do something, but I'm looking for advice today. What can I do or not do relative to talking to these people who own the remaining parcels? So somebody can kind of get at the grassroots, not the NR, you know, all the other things, but what do I do today? Thank you very much.
So hopefully you'll be around for the next session, because we'll be getting into that. And it's really about, I mean, all of this is what we're talking about is a prerequisite for what is ultimately raising sources of capital to fund, to do transactions, voluntary transactions with landowners to do preservation. So that's what the next session will be about. I believe we have lunch, is that right? And before we do that, I just wanted to give a big round of applause to our panelists.
One other just quick announcement before we let you all loose for lunch. I would just like to take a quick moment and point out the people who will be serving on the second panel of the day. So if you want to kind of engage them in conversation while you're enjoying a sandwich, you can do so. Maybe you could stand up or raise your hands when I call your name. First, we're very lucky to have representatives from the Trust for Public Land join us today. We have both the New York State Director, Carter Strickland, who's a great resource and a great leader who's done quite a lot to advance conservation throughout the state over his storied career. And we're also very lucky to have Will Abinger, who flew in from Florida to share his expertise with us today. Will, for those who know him, is probably the nation's preeminent expert on passing ballot referenda at the local level. He works nationwide, consulting with communities and providing critical information to help them achieve their goals. Also, Supervisor Michael Sweeten from Warwick is here. He's got a successful Community Preservation Fund program in his community, and standing right next to him is Robert McKeon, Supervisor of the town of Red Hook. And earlier today you met Kevin Macdonald from the Nature Conservancy, who's been a fierce advocate for CPFs and natural resource protection on Long Island. So we're going to take about 15 or 20 minutes, grab a sandwich, a second cup of coffee, and enjoy some lunch, and we'll give you a little bit of a warning before reconvening. Thank you.
Thank you. How about a big hand of applause for Scenic Hudson for such a great job. And I'm going to say some remarks while Carly's done an amazing job too. Thank you. Gets our slides up. So we're going to have the same format, and we're going to start with my colleague Will Abinger. So the theme for this, get your questions ready. And we're going to start with this gentleman from Goshen when we get to the question section, and I'm going to moderate. But the theme for this panel is all these folks have run successful campaigns from, Long Island. You heard Kevin earlier, and we'll conclude with him. Red Hook, Warwick, and Will, my colleague, nationally. So I want to say, and this is our only brag about what Trust for Public Land does, we've raised now $75 billion in public financing, including last week. Will and his team had 8 ballot measures nationally and raised $4.1 billion for conservation. And the numbers are impressive, but I want to leave you with this. Of that, $3.4 billion was a statewide measure, sporting good tax in Texas. And not known as the bluest of blue states, right? And so, although it may be changing, but in our panels, I think it's helpful to look at the issues. And we're going to ask about property taxes. We're going to ask about obstacles. I don't think it's helpful, and it's actually maybe dispiriting to talk about the R and the D labels, right? Because, as we say, people vote green 80% of the time if you go on landvote.org, not red or blue. So let's get to the issues. We can leave politics aside, and it's actually important for 501c3s too. So without further ado, we're going to hear from our experts about what's worked, and we can also ask them about how they got around things that don't work. Will, take it away.
Thanks very much, Carter. And it's great to be here in the Hudson River Valley. Let me just echo what Carter said, and hopefully this will come out in some of my remarks here. But land conservation today, even when it comes to voting to raise your taxes, is not a partisan issue for voters in this country. We win ballot measures regularly in red states, blue states, in between. Voters care deeply about protecting their water quality, protecting the character of their communities, and protecting those things that make them special. So my role here today is to give you a bit of a national overview in terms of what's happening around the country in terms of ballot measures where voters are being given an opportunity to vote to dedicate funding of one sort or another about land conservation, and then sort of come back in a little bit into what's happened here in New York State in terms of ballot measure activity recently, before turning it over to the other experts on the panel to get it more into the Community Preservation Fund and what's happening here locally. So when we think about where funding in the United States for conservation comes from, a lot of people think about Washington, D.C. and what Congress may be doing, the Land and Water Conservation Fund you may have heard, but the fact of the matter is the majority of funding for conservation in this country today happens at the state and local level. Things like the Community Preservation Fund here in New York State, or at the state level, the Environmental Protection Fund, where your state legislature is regularly appropriating on the order of $300 million a year for land conservation. That's almost as much as Congress appropriates every year under the Land and Water Conservation Fund for national parks, national wildlife refuges, national forests across the country. So roughly 80% of funding happens at the local and state level, public funding for parks and conservation. And a large majority of that is actually ballot measures where voters are being asked to vote to approve funding for conservation or parks. This chart shows you going back to 1996. We don't have the 2019 election results here, but the blue bar is the passage rate, so the percentage of measures that are on the ballot that are being passed. And the gray line is the total amount of funding that's generated in any one year. So as Carter said, the overall passage rate when voters are given an opportunity to vote on funding for conservation is around 75–76%. So 3 out of every 4 measures that are put before the voters asking them to dedicate funding for conservation are approved. And the point of this slide is, this is somebody said, I think it was Laura said durable earlier. This is a durable concept. You can see through the recession, through the changes at the national level in terms of politics, who we're voting for president, through some rather major events, historical events, political events, you might say, that support has remained consistent at about 75–76%. This is where those ballot measures are happening across the country. This information comes from the Trust for Public Lands Land Vote database. It's a publicly accessible online database. We track all land conservation ballot measures throughout the country. And as you can see, they're happening in a variety of places. Obviously, there's a correlation between growth and where these ballot measures are happening. There's also a really strong correlation in places that you see pulled out, like New Jersey, Massachusetts. If you look at Florida or Colorado, those are all states where there's a state funding program for conservation. So in New Jersey, if your town, and hundreds of cities have, and all 21 of New Jersey counties have a dedicated voter-approved open space trust fund that makes you eligible for funding from their Green Acres program and their farmland preservation program. This is looking back at the last general election, the 2018 election, and so you can see the number of measures on the ballot, the passage rate. The passage rate in the 2018 general election was actually a little bit higher than that national average, and a large amount of funding approved by voters. Again, to try to bust the myth that this is somehow a partisan issue, you see one of our campaign advertisements for the Georgia Outdoor Stewardship Act. Georgia voters approved at 83% a dedication of that portion of the state sales tax that's attributable to the purchases of sporting goods for their state land conservation program. So again, very red state, overwhelming approval for land conservation. In this particular election, the Trust for Public Land and our Conservation Finance Program was involved in about a third of those measures and about 2/3 of the funding. And then Carter made reference also to the election we just had last Tuesday. Generally what's called an off-year election or odd-year election, not as much activity on the ballot in general, but pretty good level for land conservation and park funding. 30 measures on the ballot in 14 states around the country. 24 of those were approved, including, similar to Georgia, a sporting goods sales tax. Texas voters approved constitutionally dedicated funding for parks and conservation in Texas now. And as Carter said, we were involved in 8 of those ballot measures at the Trust for Public Land and our Conservation Finance Program, and I'm really proud to say we won all 8. So we work with communities across the country at the state and local level to help them design and win ballot measures that are dedicating funding for conservation. And our track record is pretty good, over 570 successful ballot measures, creating about now $79 billion in new funding for parks and conservation across the country. These are some of the measures we worked on in New York. We had the good fortune to work with both Warwick and Red Hook on their ballot measures, but I've also worked on a number of bond measures, including with the town of New Paltz that's also here today. And so I wanted to spend my remaining time talking about how we get to that level of success, how we feel like, what's the sort of recipe if we want to pass, get voters to approve a land conservation ballot measure in our community. And the first step for us is always feasibility research. That's fundamentally understanding what are the finance options that are available in your community, how much funding will they generate for parks and conservation, and what's the impact on taxpayers. And that's really important to beginning to design a ballot measure that's going to have a good chance for winning. The second step for us is understanding what voter attitudes are, and I know a lot of people have different feelings about polls one way or another. We hear a lot about polls in the presidential election year like we're coming up on here in 2020, but we feel that a professionally administered, statistically valid public opinion survey of voters in the community is a very important tool to understanding voter attitudes towards conservation. We polled, for instance, in both Red Hook and Warwick before those measures came to the ballot, and that poll was really instrumental in helping us understand how to win those ballot measure campaigns. Based on what we've learned in the feasibility study and the poll, we're then able to come forward with a pretty well-informed recommendation about what the finance mechanism should be, how much the measure should be for, what kind of purposes and uses for funds should be emphasized, when it should be on the ballot, and what kind of accountability provisions it should include. And those are sort of the key variables in ballot measure design. And if we can get those right, we feel like we have a really good chance of winning. We always call out the actual ballot language as a separate step because this is critically important. This is what you read when you cast your ballot, when you walk into the voting booth on election day. There are legal rules, particularly for the Community Preservation Fund, that you have to follow, but within that, there are ways to make sure that voters understand what they're voting on and that they understand what the benefits of a yes vote would be. We also work on the campaign. We're doing all of the same kind of things in our campaign that elected officials do in their campaigns for elected office. Obviously, the difference is we're trying to dedicate funding for parks and conservation. And these are also the services that the Trust for Public Lands Conservation Finance program provides. So I'm going to stop there. Carter?
There we go. Okay, I'm Mike Sweeten, supervisor in the town of Warwick here in Orange County. And we had, I think, the 6th successful CPF referendum after the 5 towns of Long Island. We had in 1999 a referendum of our own voters to bond $9.5 million for farmland preservation. And we quickly, once we got that implemented, we quickly realized that was going to go very fast. We're the largest town in Orange County. Agriculture is still our largest industry. And so we were starting to preserve a fair amount of farms and realized that we needed an additional revenue source if we were going to continue to be successful. And that's when we started to look into this concept that had been in existence on the 5 towns in Long Island. And I heard it before, so I don't want to discourage you, but it is a little bit of a road. And you saw it this year in the legislature, and that's kind of what I'm going to focus on, because 1 or 2 individuals can bottle your effort up in the legislature. And our effort initially was to do it with Orange County, and then 4 towns in Orange County the next year decided to try to do it. And then we just kept getting bottled up in committees, and finally decided to, I'm kind of stubborn, so I said, listen, they gave the authority to Long Island, why would they deny it to anybody else? And so we just decided to persevere. We were advised on Long Island, I think it's 2% was the fee, and we were advised if we were to lower that number, it would sail through the legislature. Well, that didn't really happen, but we did lower it to 3/4% on transfers within the town. So after 4 years of that struggle, it did get passed in July of 2005, and then we began down the road to how do we go to the voters with this. Several key things you need. You need a dedicated group of volunteers. We kind of had that with the PDR effort, so we had a good nucleus, but you do need that. We used the PDR group. We used the Warwick Conservation Board, which was one of the first conservation boards in New York State, I believe. And we used a group called Community 2000, which had done a visioning in the 90s for what Warwick wanted to be in the year 2000. One of the things that came out of that community effort was the recognition that farmland was precious to the town, it defined the town, and we wanted to continue to preserve it. We also had a lot of dairy farms like Doug had in his community, and we don't have as many anymore, but we have a lot of other farms. So one of the key things with answering, well, dairy's not going to survive here in the Hudson Valley is, well, maybe not. That's not in our control, but other farming will survive. We're only 50 miles from New York City, and people there finally realize they need to understand where food comes from. So I think that's a good selling point to your community. Polling, as you mentioned, was critical because it tells you where you are, and it tells you how much support you can lose as the campaign starts and still be successful, right? So we were very grateful to Stuart Lowry, and Kevin was involved in getting us information on where we were and where we needed to continue to go. We did develop a community preservation plan, and I echo Kari's comments, it doesn't need to be perfect. We took all of the facets of our zoning. We had overlay zones, as I mentioned, and we just put a big map on the table and overlaid them all, and we went through the parcels. We excluded any that were in our planning process that had preliminary approval, but we added most of the large tracts, and it never became an issue as, hey, my property's in or not. The fact that the hearing on the plan, it was known that, how come I'm not in the plan? So, that was really a big thing. But we did it, and we explained in it why each section aquifer protection, farmland, open space, historic structures, why it was important. We listed them all, and again, if they were in multiple categories, it helped us target where we wanted to try to get funds. We also then developed a case study, again, about why you needed it. It's just a pamphlet. It talks about the cost of residential housing, how it does not pay for itself in a tax sense for the municipality, and in a lot of ways for schools either, because it just continues to add more children, which we don't adequately, the state doesn't adequately fund their education. And then we got people on the very back page to sign up to support it, people in the community and from all over the community, so that we could show that there was widespread support for this effort. Great piece of advice I think Stuart Lowry gave me was, don't deny it's a tax, because it is a tax. And if you try to say it's something else, they throw that back at you and say you're just tax. Yes, it is a tax, but here's the benefit of that tax, right? So I grew up in my town and I had a business, and over that time I paid for at least 3 schools, 37 fire trucks, and I said, we built this really special community here over the generations, and you want to come here, we want you to come here. But is it unreasonable to ask you to help us continue to keep it a good community? And that was a persuasive argument, I think. Forums, we held small groups, big groups. We had realtors come into a room and answer and give their sort of issues, and we had answers for them. Fundraising, you do need fundraising because you will have to spend some money. It's like a political campaign, and we had a bunch of different stuff, and I'm just going to run through those real quick for you to give you some examples of them. So these were bumper stickers that we did and put on cars, as many as we could. As we handed them out, on the back of them, where you peel it off, there was some information. It was good. We see still a lot of those on the cars in Warwick today. Obviously, we played up our strength, which was farming, and reinforced in people's minds that without farms, you're going to have to depend on food coming from places that don't have the same kind of safety regulations that we have, right? These were postcard mailings that we put out, very small, different scenes on them, and the town of Warwick was big. Your towns may be the same. You may have different interests. We have a whole section of the town that has no farms. It's Greenwood Lake, and it has a beautiful lake and recreation area, but no farms. So in the PDR effort, they were kind of against PDR and voted it down in their section of the town because they didn't see a benefit. They now do see a benefit, but we wanted to target the different areas to show that it has value for different things for you. And on the back of that card was just some good bullet points about the benefit of community preservation. That these were that bigger mailer that you get from politicians all the time in the mail, right? These drop piece things that people hate. But again, we did these with targeting different constituencies and areas, and I think that was a smart way to do that. So, what would you pay for clean water? And then on the back of it, it talked about the benefits of community preservation. In the Greenwood Lake area, we found some prominent citizens to come out and support, to show that, yeah, there's no farms here, but it does have a benefit to us, right? And we had testimonials from them, and then we went to other residents in the area to get them to sign up. We got a realtor or two that was actually thought it was a good idea, right? And we put that on one of our mailers. And then she has a little testimonial on the back. We were advised, by the way, that, well, first of all, the State Real Estate Association hates it, right? They think it's like an attack on their industry. We were advised we would get a strong effort from them in our referendum in 2006. We didn't. We did get local realtor opposition. They did some signs, no new taxes, that kind of thing. I will tell you today that the first thing a realtor does with a client is drive them past the preserved lands in the town of Warwick. And they tell them it's never going to be developed. During the recession of 08 to 10, home prices in Warwick did decline, but not as severely as they did in other places in Orange County. And I take credit for it. It's the preservation that we have. So this is another one, picture perfect Warwick, preserved for these reasons. Wrong choice, right choice, farmland. Water's a good one. We all know water's a critical resource. It's a good selling point, right? No land, no water, water quality issues, runoff, all of those things that come with development. This is the best one for even today, right? We went and made a pitch to both the local Republican committee and the Democratic committee and got them to sign on and support it. So we did that mailing, and then you have the listing there in the little endorsement. So it doesn't have to be a political issue, you know. So. And here's what the results are. It passed in 2006. We raised over $9 million, preserved 4,200 acres, 1,600 with that, and that 1,600 acres cost $23 billion, so we only raised $9 million. It shows you what having a source of funding will do for your community, because you can leverage it into federal, state, private land trust investment in your community. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Robert McKeon, the town supervisor in Red Hook, and many thanks to Mike and the folks who preceded us. In many respects, Red Hook has been following as much as it has been leading in some of these efforts. And I'll start this afternoon by saying timing is everything. So I'll give you a little bit of context before I get started with the slides. In the late 90s, Scenic Hudson, this wonderful organization that's brought us together once again today, had 2 pilot communities for farmland preservation. The town of Red Hook was one of them. They protected 7 farms in our community in 1998. And piggybacking on that, a few years later, I had proposed to our Agriculture and Open Space Committee that we have our own local bond funding with a referendum, and that was back in 2001 and 2. It got politicized a little bit. The town board eventually supported it, put up for a permissive referendum $3.5 million. A candidate for office gathered enough signatures to bring it to a public referendum, in which case I woke up one morning and then had to have a campaign put together, public referendum, and as those of you who know the timing of all that, between 45 and 62 days later. And so with the benefit of a lot of paper and an inkjet printer and a couple of banners and a few hay rides, was able to get some type of sort of basic campaign for a PDR program. The voters in October of 2007 supported that initiative by 83% to 17 no. So it was overwhelming support to preserve Red Hook and its working landscapes. So 2 years later, we instituted a conservation easement program for other types of important open space parcels, including the ability to put land under a term easement. And then shortly thereafter, lobbying with some of these great folks here, Andy Bicking and Scenic Hudson and Kevin, trying to get state enabling legislation for larger regions. We decided that we would endeavor in Red Hook to get our own home rule request passed and put that up for the voters to decide. So I will begin today. Here's the Red Hook campaign, and that's really sort of my focus, is how to institute a campaign. And the opposite of the 2003 campaign, which was very simple and didn't cost very much money. Scenic Hudson, again, in its infinite wisdom, knew that Red Hook and I and many other volunteers would need as much assistance. TPL was right there with us, the Nature Conservancy, because we wanted to learn about other communities and what they had encountered. So here we are in 2007, and what's changed? Well, the economy has changed, and it's changed dramatically, right? So in 2008, we knew what everybody was feeling in 2007, which is real estate was suffering. And so this campaign was going to be much more challenging than with the PDR. And unlike what happened in Mike's community, is I had the good fortune of having the president of the state Realtors Association be a Red Hook resident and recently elected. And she was committed to making sure that this referendum did not pass. And in fact, she had convinced the association to use some of their mobilization fund. And, you know, it sounds just as positive as the terminology itself. So, Red Hook Campaign 2007. Okay, so here are some of the things that we did preceding the referendum. Polling, Trust for Public Lands, it's already been touched on. Positive messaging, but I can tell you it's just as important to have the negative messaging polled, because you want to know what's coming your way and what you have to answer to and what you have to defend. And so that was really informative. As you can imagine, a campaign like this where you're going up against the State Realtors Association and misinformation, disinformation campaigns. So the coordination, we had tremendous assistance from Scenic Hudson. Can't thank them enough. They knew how to bring everybody together outside of our immediate community. We did supply the volunteers. We supplied the talent for a lot of the marketing materials, but Scenic Hudson knew what was necessary. We met weekly, by the way. I think it was something like a 15 or 16 week period, and they helped us coordinate that. Trusted sources, Mike's already touched upon that. We reached out to people in our community that were well known and asked them for support. Could we use that support on marketing materials? Educational outreach, we had info sessions and marketing materials, so mailing. So what I'm going to do is just pass around. I don't think I brought enough for everyone. This is returned mail, so please don't call the people with the names and address on the back of it. But if you want to keep that, maybe one for each community, or if you're here with somebody, take a look at that. This was our first mailer. It's a trifold. We tried to cover all of the basic questions and issues associated with the tool itself, because we thought the best way to attack this was to get out as much information initially as we could and try to address those questions that predictably have been asked in previous campaigns. So the first mailer was that trifold. We had lots of posters around town. Volunteers, obviously you can't do an initiative like this unless you have a group of volunteers. I think we had about 20, and we would meet every week. We'd probably have about 8 or 9 that would come every week. Door-to-door campaigns with our materials. This was our first mailer. Back in the day, they used to say the picture was worth 1,000 words. That's until Twitter, and now we only need 120 some odd characters. But we knew that images like this would resonate with our residents. Some signage, keep it simple. Families just wandering aimlessly in a field. But it really is about quality of life. And here we go, we talked about those trusted sources in the back there. I think Mike's materials are similar. The individuals that we thought were well-known in our community. And here are some recurring ideas. It protects your children's future. It controls property taxes. When I did the PDR campaign, it was all based upon one of my cows, Daisy. Daisy doesn't go to school. So again, going back to what's net positive for your community, preserve our quality of life. You know, one of the things that you want to make sure your dissenters know is that property values are enhanced by preservation. We looked at a study back in the day which said, all other things being equal, if you have significant amount of open space preserved in your community, you can expect something in the order of 22% higher valuations. So I think in the earlier panel, we talked about insurance. So the way I talk to people about this real estate transfer fee or tax, whatever it is you have two choices. You can give me $100, and I can't tell you what the heck's gonna happen with your investment, or you can give me $101, and I can tell you that we're gonna do a lot of things that are going to make that a very good investment. And I doubt you're gonna get a lot of people giving you $100. They're gonna give you $101. And so that's what, you know, is a message, the financial message, I think, for folks. If you look at places like Hilton Head, what's unusual about Hilton Head is they actually started with the preservation many, many years ago. There was no development there. They figured out where they were going to preserve first, and then they developed around it like a conservation subdivision. Again, more mailers. Here's my favorite. My wife and I and kids, we generally gather around the table and look at the water glass and see what's floating in it. You want to have just the right amount of things floating in your water. Again, water pulls the highest in everything, protecting drinking water. So we thought these images would resonate with our folks. Global warming, it wasn't that big a deal back then. Now of course, it does resonate. And this image was actually catered towards a younger group of constituents. So we really thought about what were the messages that we wanted to have, and what were the images that would go along with it. We do have a card also with a broker endorsement of it, that people move to our community because of the open space and the quality of life. So the results in the worst recession that we've had in decades was that this referendum passed by 31 votes. So if you looked at that chart that TPL had up here earlier, and you looked at the years, it matters. So you're in a better climate now, I would tell you. And the Hudson Valley has been discovered, and so you have, your constituents, I think, truly understand now that you live in a desirable place, and that desirability is good for your pocketbook, it's good for your future. So with that said, I will pass it over to my buddy Kevin Macdonald.
Thank you. So, let's see how this works. All right. So I intentionally have no material from the campaign from 20 years ago, partly because some of the messages are exactly what these guys put up, because we talked about it. They polled on it, we polled on it. And the messages don't change, for the most part, right? And the East End of Long Island is not a regular place as compared to the rest of New York, and the comparisons made would have been ludicrous for some of you, and you wouldn't have appreciated it. So their examples are real, their messages were tried. We talked about some of these messaging. We gave our poll results out to anybody who will ask. That's a subtle hint, right? If you want to talk about how to message this, we have it, they have it. You just heard it. So the first session, there was a discussion on how do you do your natural resource inventory, which initially I said, this is pretty wonky stuff, what a way to start a workshop, right? But then I came to appreciate it a bit more, because if you can't talk about what matters in your community really well, you can't get to the next step, which is, why do I need this funding source, and why are you asking me to support it? So you have to do that necessary work. First, you have to understand it really well. You have to be able to message it well. And the biggest takeaway message that I'll give you before I go through this exercise is, one of the things that we did, and I know you guys did this too, which was the common bias is we all work with the people we're working with already. We have all our friends in conservation, we have a few local friends in the civic groups, and we all get together and we basically have groupthink. We all think we're better than that, but sort of that's what happens. And one of the things that we did intentionally was we actually went out and talked to people we never talked to before. So I met with realtors, and I asked one of the realtors, big firm in the town of Southampton, you know, mega mansion sales all the time, and I asked him to support this initiative. We had never met, but he knew me, and he was roughly my age at the time. We were in our early 40s, and he said, after a long conversation, he said, well, listen, I support open space, my kids like to go to the beach and the water and all this stuff, because I get it. And then he said, but I'd like to see the big picture. What's already been protected? What do you still need to protect and why? What will it cost? How this fund answers those questions, which was a stroke of genius. He basically said, show me the strategic plan to protect this place that you're telling me you want me to support. And it was the best advice I got by having a conversation I never would have otherwise have had. So go talk to people you don't talk to. And your assignment today is go talk to 5 people you've never talked to before. Once you answer some of these other questions, what are we talking about? How much do you want to protect? Why? Why does it matter? And go talk to 5 people and get their reaction. And if you can't answer their questions well, you're not ready. If you can answer their questions well, you are. One of the realtors that I talked to said, I'll get a bunch of people in my business in a room. And I said, okay, great. So he calls me up and he says, we're going to meet at the Wainscott Chapel. Okay. I grabbed my local assembly person at the time and I said, what are you doing? He says, I'm in the office. I said, I'm going to pick you up. We're going to take a ride. Wainscott Chapel was right down the road. He goes, where are we going? This is before cell phones. And then I said, we're going to meet with the realtors at the Wainscott Chapel. Paul is going to let us pitch the CPF stuff. And I said, Paul says these are the better guys in the business. They're not the knuckle scrapers. And he was like, yeah, there's a look on his face, big eyes, right? And he was like, really? I said, yeah. So to make a long story short, I don't believe too much in divine moments, but this was a pretty weird experience, right? So we pitched this to the realtors. 10 or 12 of them stayed around for the rest of the discussion and agreed to support this campaign. And 3 of them wanted nothing to do with it, and they told on us, and they told all the New York and the Long Island Board of Realtors that we had met with them and we were trying to subvert their industry and all this other stuff. It was fine. But the message is go talk to people you don't talk to and get their reaction, right? So I'm going to go, this exercise is an assessment of what you should be looking at as you go forward one way or another in this exercise, right? I mean, in this endeavor. What are the general economic conditions? What's the anti-tax sentiment in your community now? Is it high, is it low? It should be lower because of the tax cap. When we ran these things, there were school districts that were having 10, 12, 14% tax increases. one year to the next to the next. Do you have money for your campaign? You could have the best intentions with the best plan and the same old friends, and if you don't have money for your campaign to do pieces of mail like these guys found, the probability of winning is lower. So what we ended up doing when we started assessing these, we didn't do this before, we did this after we had won. And what we said was, you know what, there are certain common, consistent, repetitive circumstances that are present in every campaign. And these are most of them, and in your community they may be other specialized ones. And what we did was we sort of set up a numeric scoring that said, the higher the numbers for most of the positive things that you had to deal with, the better you were likely to succeed. And we also measured in the last line the opposition strength. Were we going to did the Long Island Builders or the Long Island Realtors drop $1 million on our campaign? I am the only person sitting in this room that won a whole bunch of CPF campaigns and lost a devastating, crushing defeat in the town of Brookhaven because the realtors and the builders and the commercial realtors dropped $1 million campaign on us and they ran us over. His campaign was on May 1st of 2007. By then, the real estate recession was happening, but nobody really knew what a collateralized debt obligation was or a subprime mortgage was. By November of that year, everybody knew what they were. It was a horror, right? So what we found, you can do this on your own, and the drill you did earlier is much more refined here. Anything below 20 or 21 runs the risk of not passing. Things above 21, 22, 23 and higher run the probability of passing, right? So you look at these and then you go, this is a different version of your sort of condition assessment. Is your coalition strength good? If it's only good, that's an easy thing to fix. Don't work on building your coalition. If you have no money, then you have the wrong people at the table. You know, for those of you that, I mean, this is a partnership strategy. You have to have, and you guys know this, your local government has to be pulling in the same direction. You have to be aligned with them on your campaign. Your community groups have to be aligned on your campaign. And it can't just be, you guys are great. Your leadership is awesome, and you really have this down. Thanks so much. Tell me how it works out, right? It's no. We're all in this together. Our job, and in the NGO world, is to support that campaign because we're all in this together. So I'm sure you guys talk to different people than maybe normally, right? And you talk to a lot of people about how, I know you do, in particular, right? So that's what this takes. So if you're not having a lot of cups of coffee, maybe even beer later in the day, with a lot of different people about how they react to this, how they're persuaded by the case you're making. In effect, what you're doing is you're testing out your message on an individualized focus group way, and that's giving you the feedback you need to see whether the strength of your argument is refined enough. So, all of these things are essential to your success. And you know, we'll leave this up, or you'll get an email later, and if anybody wants to talk about it at another time, you can. The one that lost was Wilton, and the one that also lost was in Brookhaven. I'm not going to get into the details, it's too traumatic. But some of the other ones won. And what we have done since is every time we have a campaign, we run through the same elements. And it's really been, we probably have 20 campaigns now on this spreadsheet. And these numbers and the categories are solid. So you could do this yourself and then find out we need more coalition people. And what is your coalition? So, and the last point on that. If you just have the usual suspects, you're not thinking big enough. You need the hardware store owner, you need a banker, you need people in Rotary clubs, and other people you don't talk to. And will it take 6 months to gain their trust and let them get comfortable with saying yes? Yes. This takes time. Don't just go and visit somebody and say, we're about to do a piece of mail, you've never seen it before, you don't know who I am, and I'm going to send this out. Sign right here. That's not happening. Right? They're going to go, thanks for the visit, you're freaking me out. Right? So this is all about a cultivation over time and a comfort level. And I will leave you with this last thought, because this is true. While we were setting up and running this campaign, which took a few years for us to ramp up, we also got some breaks. Suffolk County was doing some ballot measures on other things, and we just diverted all the energy that we were setting up for the bigger campaign to these other opportunities, and we were getting other funding along the way. And then when we finally ran our campaign, everybody who was successfully involved in it knew that an amazingly special thing had happened, and we've been lifelong friends since. And these are people I've never hung out with. So it's a really cool thing. It's a great moment that we all experience, and we know it's different and special. And the last point is, on the East End, there's been about $1 billion in land protection that's been invested in, and it's saved about 20,000 acres of land that never would have been protected. And the landscape of the region is different. There are parks and business districts that never would have happened that anchor the business district for an economic purpose. So, happy to help any way I can. My best wishes to all of you for your success.
All right, well, that was an incredible panel. I'll give this to you. I'll just talk about it. And so we only have about 10 minutes left, so think about your questions. I want to ask some basic things that maybe, cut across a few things. I'll just speak about it. First of all, I want, those materials are great, and obviously you can all learn and build on the strengths, so each iteration gets stronger. One thing that you alluded to in your discussions, but didn't talk about in your campaign materials, was the concept of leverage. And maybe that's a hindsight thing, but we all know that the missing leg of the three-legged stools that we've in New York, at least, over the last 10 years or so, on a widespread basis, has been local funding. We've got great state funding, federal funding has been there. Local, not so much, or not as strong as it's been. Has that been useful when you talk to people? Would you, if you knew now about the leverage, is that something that, I'll address this to the supervisors, my follow-up for you, is that something that you would emphasize?
Yeah, I definitely would emphasize it. And we've been successful in every submission of farm to both the state and federal programs over the past 10 years because we have the match. And we do 100% of the value, so it's not an issue. We also pay for successful candidates. We pay for their survey, for their legal involvement. So it's a huge selling point to say, hey, look what we've done. We've preserved 4,200 acres, total of $32 million, and the town's cost on that is to date about $11 million. So.
Yeah, and I would echo what Mike says as always, and say that if you want to tap into some of that money, you have to have a match. So it's critical. It goes a long way. I think Rep. Up in Warwick's experience has been with land trusts in the county and the state, just very positive. We've leveraged many times over each dollar.
The only other thing I would add is, East Hampton and Southampton, famous Hamptons, have very robust community preservation funds. 3 of the other towns are much more normal and more humble. And the line we used through the campaign consistently was, the Community Preservation Fund is the key that opens the door to county and state matching funds. And the towns that were a little less robust in their funding latched onto that. It was very effective, and you just heard the testimony to the effect as well.
Well, yeah, I just want to say this whole concept of matching funds is very compelling to voters. I don't remember specifically if we rolled it in Red and Warwick. I know we did in some of the towns on Long Island, but the idea of being able to leverage your local tax dollars against state and federal funding and private funding too is really compelling to voters.
Thank you. And sticking with Michael and Robert, just for to answer or anticipate what the gentleman from Goshen asked about, and also those towns that might not yet have authority, what can be done now? I mean, Kevin gave us some great homework to do now that we can start strengthening points, making sure you're robust. But what can be done now? Either if you don't have authority, or politics don't look good. And another way to ask that is, what types of information or resources did you have that you, when you look back, were helpful in preparing for your ballot initiative?
Well, so for us, I mean, there's lots of other things you can do. You don't necessarily need the Community Preservation Fund, although it's huge. You can do it through zoning. We have bonus incentives in our zoning for clustering on small lots, so we preserve on average 60% of the site that gets developed as open space, so you can do that. It's easy. One community in Orange County that fell out of our effort decided to just go with a tax in each budget year for land preservation. So your board can do that if they're supportive. You can float a bond. You can just do a bond yourself. Again, your board needs to be supportive, but you can do that. So there's lots of tools.
I would say you're already doing it today, which is learning from other communities and their successes. Having that information, so you go to your electorate and say, look, this is the experience that Warwick and the East End Island towns had, the town of Red Hook. We can speak to property values. Property values in Red Hook are going up at a nice clip, not anything crazy, but it just really is a very strong positive thing that's happened for our community. I can tell you that when we show images of our protected lands, when we show maps of our protected parcels and numbering into the thousands of acres, we now have justified to any of those dissenters why it was a smart move. And we have a lot of folks who have, joined the bandwagon. And I will say that, you're looking at two individuals that instituted a tax program with the PDR. You're looking at two individuals that were key to, this CPF as well. And they didn't even run anybody against him, and I just won by almost 2-1. So, I mean, that's the kind of feedback that is really, I think, important when you're thinking about the risks you might be taking.
And I'll also say it has a positive effect on taxes, right? Because we know residential development doesn't pay enough for itself, and the tax cap has helped certainly, but the school taxes in Warwick, right, have stabilized. Town taxes were one of the lowest in Orange County. And a lot of that is because we're not providing the additional services that residential development brings with it.
So the early actions I would suggest folks need to be doing, whether you're in the community or you're at the municipal level or you're even a legislator thinking about how to do this. You need to gather your facts, you need to get your plan. And what you will go through when you talk to the people you don't normally talk to is when you meet with your banker friend or somebody else there, they're going to say, what have you protected? What do you still need to protect? What's it going to cost? What other sources of revenue did you look at? Let's run those numbers. And those are great conversations because you may actually find, you know what? We can do this another way and we don't have to fight this hard. Or there's no other way to do this and we have to do this. In which case, that's a conversation you can have with somebody and they'll appreciate that you thought to do that first and that you did all that work and you can answer to them in that moment.
Thank you, sir. So one last question by me for Will, picking up on this point 3, money for campaign, just to get something very tangible out there. Let's put you on the spot. What are we looking at? So you're a supervisor, you want to build up a war chest. What's the range? What's been your experience?
Carter, I get asked that question all the time, and I will never generalize about how much it takes to run a campaign. There's so many different variables that go into it. Number one, are you going to have organized opposition? If we hadn't gone dollar for dollar with the realtors in your community, I submit to you we would have lost. So that's That's one big factor that influences a campaign budget. When you're on the ballot, obviously also influences a campaign budget. If you're on the ballot in a lower turnout election, obviously you don't have to communicate with as many voters, but there are also huge benefits to being on a higher turnout election. The other main factor is how are you polling? I mean, our numbers look pretty good in both Red Hook and Warwick going in. We knew we had a good shot of winning, otherwise we probably would advise them not to go forward with Community Preservation Fund at that time. Absent knowing the answers to those different variables, it's impossible to estimate. I mean, we've run campaigns for as little as a couple $1,000s, you know, when numbers were really high and we had no opposition and we were on a high turnout election. Other times it can be upwards of $1 million, so it really varies. So.
For us, we had a lot of in-kind services from many volunteers and organizations. I think out of pocket was somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000 for our campaign.
So, you know, a good poll in any community is going to be about $25,000. If you do focus groups, that could be another $20,000. Some of you will go, oh, we don't have to do that. You're wrong. You have to do it because the greatest danger is being so assumptive in your belief that you know what the public's already thinking. You have to talk to people you don't talk to. And a poll is the community manifestation of talking to people that you can't always talk to. And you have to do that.
So I want to get to at least one audience question. I'm going to look at Danny for time. But yeah, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am, sorry.
On the, and I may have this, may not.
You talk so soft.
First time anybody's told me that. Hi, so I may have this incorrect, but my understanding is that CPF funds cannot be used for maintenance after a property is purchased. One, I wanted to confirm that. And two, if that's actually correct, how are you all maintaining the properties? Where are you drawing the funds from to maintain the properties that have been purchased?
Mike, you want to start with that?
Well, we don't, the only property that we actually owned was a historic site in the village of Florida. It was this Henry Seward birthplace. And we transferred that in a sort of a lease to the village of Florida, who's pursuing renovating it, right? Not with community preservation money. All the other properties we've secured, we don't use community preservation for. We either hold their development rights, because most of it is farms. In the Green Lake area, we did secure the only public access to the lake, a beach property or marina property, and turned it into a beach, but we maintain that through general tax dollars.
Yeah. The legislation.
Really quickly, to clarify, if you're a community in Westchester, Putnam, or Ulster County, the legislation does require that you set aside a portion of the fund for stewardship. I believe that the law stipulates, it says up to 25%, but a minimum of 10% could be, you know, or a maximum of 10% could be spent in any given year. If you're a community outside of those counties, the law and what it requires varies, and we'd have to look at the enabling legislation to kind of answer that question. If you're a community in Orange County that is hoping to get an Orange County Community Preservation Act out of the next legislative session, you would most likely be added to the same program for Westchester, Putnam, and Ulster counties, so you would still have that basic baseline stewardship requirement.
For Red Hook, we had in our home rule legislation an allowance for up to 10% for maintenance. And I just wanted to add before we conclude, there are a couple of special things you might consider how you want to coordinate your real estate transfer fees. So we knew we were going to face an argument about affordable housing, so we did ours a little bit differently than they did in Long Island, and we don't start the fee until the county median sales price. And we do the full 2% above and beyond that. So we just added a higher percentage and a higher threshold, at least in our case.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Okay, I have two. One's quick, and the other one hopefully maybe longer. Yeah, so the first one is if you can speak to how much the feasibility studies cost, because we do have a grant category in that, but wasn't really sure what the actual cost of that were. And the second question is, you talked about leveraging funds for farmland protection, but I know a lot of the municipalities are here today are looking to conserve more natural areas, and I'm wondering if you can speak to what kind of funds are available to leverage for protected lands that are more about conservation value for wildlife, habitat, water, things like that.
Yeah, so comprehensive feasibility study, looking at the finance mechanisms and other things I talked about is about 20,000.
We're working with a land trust to protect some waters, some land with water quality funds with the state. So,
a lot of the farms that we preserve are in multiple categories. So there's aquifer protection on some of those farms. So we're active in that as well. And you can always expend the money if it's in your plan and in a category for a piece. You can purchase it outright, right? So.
I guess I'm thinking about managing, you're using ag and markets.
We're using ag and markets and USDA, NRCS funding primarily, and then local land trusts. We do partner with them.
So the other thing that happened, once you have a permanent, dedicated, reliable, every year, regularly reoccurring revenue stream, you then start having conversations with the state and counties and other funding agencies, and you say, we want to do a three-way purchase with the state and the county next year, and they say next year's bad, do it the year after, we'll lock up the money, we promise. That is a regularly occurring event now. There's no formal program. It just happens because that's how it's negotiated. And the county, and it's not uncommon for the state of New York to call the town of Southampton and say, we're shy of cash this year, can you guys buy this and we'll get the parcel next to it? That's how it happens. And that's how they agree to do it. So it's the money that makes everything happen.
So that's our last word. Thank you.
And I'll just note that I think our panelists will be lingering for a little bit after the event. So if you do have questions that you want to follow up with them on, that opportunity will be there. We wanted to close everything out this afternoon with going back to how we kick things off this morning, and that is to revisit the readiness assessment. So if you did not pick up a form of this chart on your way in, Althea has copies here, and she can pass them out to you. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin and Will to just provide a few additional points of context for this and how you might want to be thinking about it moving forward.
All right, so the drill you have now comes from this exercise. So if you go one more time through your checklist of things you think you need to do, they're general. There may be things in your community that are not on this list that you would add. But all it's supposed to do is give you sort of a self-assessment of how ready do you think you are, where do you think you need to do more things, and are there other things that need to be done. And the purpose of this is then to think about who else do you need to be working with, who else do you have to get aligned with, who are the groups and the types of folks that you have little to no contact with that will matter. And then the painful exercise also is you have to sort of ground that into reality of how long do I think this will take to do right. Because there's no prize for doing it in a hurry and failing, right? So again, you can do this drill, you can do it now, you can do it when you get home, and then of course keep it to yourself and use that as the beginning of the conversation that you have to have with other friends and colleagues as you march onto this great, wonderful experience you're all about to have.
I'll also note, our goals for today's presentation, which I hope we have achieved, is one, to kind of help everyone understand a critical path forward for how their community could achieve a community preservation fund, to inspire you, but also to have a sobering moment to understand, what is the amount of work that is involved in achieving a community preservation fund, but to give you the skills to accomplish that. On the back side of the assessment, you'll see that there are a list of all the panelists and organizations that are here today. As you leave today, please consider all of them to be a resource. And if you have questions, don't hesitate to pick up the phone. I know just speaking for Scenic Hudson, and I'm sure this applies to the other 501c3 nonprofits in the room, we are more than happy to talk with you, at a much more greater level of detail to explore what potential partnerships could look like with your community to help you meet your goals. So on that note, I'll just ask our partners of the Trust for Public Land if they have any closing remarks you want to make. No? Okay, great. Well, thank you. Well, thank you everyone for coming today, and I very much appreciate your participation, and hopefully we'll be speaking soon. Thank you.